Okay, so our next brief talk will be by Bill Savedoff, my colleague. He's an economist and senior fellow here at the Center for Global Development. He previously worked at the World Health Organization and at the Inter-American Development Bank, among others. But at CGD, he led a really important working group, which was called When Will We Ever Learn? And that working group led to the start of the International Impact Evaluation Initiative, or 3IE, which I think is one of the biggest policy hits of CGD so far. And Bill's going to talk about a paper that he did with another former colleague of ours, Ruth Levine, who's now at the Hewlett Foundation, on what role funders or donors should play in this space on impact evaluation. So, Bill, take it away.
Thanks, Amanda. Amanda has inspired me to try to occupy my inner Hans Rosling, which would be very, very difficult to do, but I'll be a little bit more effusive than normal. I was just reflecting on the comments Nancy and Ambassador Vermeer were making this morning about the history of all this. I got involved in development programs in the early 90s in the Inter-American Development Bank. I remember we had directives as project team members. I was working on sewage projects and solid waste, all this really exciting stuff. And we had this directive to, address women's issues. And it was kind of like, how do you deal with women's issues? Women benefit from solid waste being collected. Women benefit from sewage being collected. Why is this? What's going on here? And I remember when it came to the solid waste project I was working on in Fortaleza, where they were taking a dump, really, and trying to create a reasonable landfill and start recycling facilities, we thought about the role that women used to have in the dump, because they were part of the garbage picking community, and to try to see that they could be, especially get positions in the new recycling plant that was going to be developed. But the only reason we had that in our mind was because we had seen something like that in Petrópolis, also in Brazil. We'd seen an experience before. We didn't have an impact evaluation, but at least we'd seen something. I think that's where a lot of this impact evaluation work is heading in making progress, is that it's 30 years later, we're actually have more examples, we have more ideas, we have more questions. And so I see Meg Berger was at the IDB, she's here. Nancy was at the executive director. Myra was also brought in for social division. It's a process of moving, and I saw it happen from being ridiculed to being resisted, and then eventually becoming mainstream. So there is progress. We've only been at it for maybe 10,000 years, but somewhere along the line we'll get there. So does this clicker go? There we go. These are my main messages. I think foreign aid means less and less. Impact evaluation means more and more. A primary role for foreign aid is actually in financing impact evaluations. That's the main point of the paper I made with Ruth, that Ruth and I made. And in reflecting on this workshop conference, it's especially the case for women's empowerment. Now, before I talk about this graph, I just want to ask, when you think of foreign aid, what do you think foreign aid does? Doesn't have to be there's no right and wrong answer. I'm just trying to get some ideas out there. What is it that foreign aid does? Promotes growth. What? Feeds children. Sorry? It supports reproductive planning. Services for reproductive rights, reproductive services, health services. Employs people in poor nations and in 5-star hotels. Infectious disease control. Really? Poverty reduction. So these are the kinds of things that come out of, what's foreign aid do? Well, when you look at what the history of foreign aid in the 50s and 60s, a lot of the discussion was about filling financing gaps. It was about capital. It was about transferring capital to countries so they would grow. So you get the credit for the 1950s answer. And then we move into this discussion later on about development as social services and things. So you get the credit for the 80s and 90s answer. It's about social services and education, and countries need these things to become developed countries. People didn't go into the governance dimension. That's the last decade, right? It's about governance. It's about accountability. It's about political growth or accountability, transparency. So it's gone through these transformations about what aid is about. And for the Hans Rosling portion of the thing, it started out very small, the share of gross national income for low-income and middle-income countries. And then it grew very, 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 very big into the 90s, where we had the development crisis, the debt crisis is back here, but then we decided we're going to do something about that debt crisis. We throw all this money into these countries. And then suddenly we get after the 2008 crisis, it starts dropping again. Okay? What we see here, and this is not to say that overseas development assistance is not increasing. It has increased in absolute terms. It's actually held pretty steady in terms of the share of the funding countries' GDPs. But low and middle income countries are actually in general growing very fast. And it's representing a smaller and smaller share of their gross national incomes. And projecting into the future, assuming that we, don't have great, zombie apocalypses or anything like that, this is the trend that's likely to continue. And if you look at the middle-income countries, which are the growing number of countries in the world, it never has been very large. It's always been in the 5% or below range. So this is all a way of saying that foreign aid is going to mean less and less in the future. It's going to be applied to fewer countries and in a much smaller number of sectors. And primarily, I would argue it's going to be very important in very low-income countries and what people sometimes call failed states. It's going to continue to be important for humanitarian assistance, always. But it's the third category, public goods, where it's going to have a really important role because the money can make a big difference in these kinds of things that are public goods, things that are shared benefits for the world as a whole. And when I say shared for the world as a whole, it's not just the low and middle income countries, it's for the rich countries as well. And a key part of that is knowledge. So knowledge. We've got, this is a story of what's happened with impact evaluation over the last in 1981 to 2011, based on a database at the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation. There were about 10 impact evaluations being done on interventions or programs in developing countries in the 80s and 90s, about 10 per year. Now think about that. That's for more than 2/3 of the population of the world, every sector you can imagine, from health to education to small enterprise to poverty reduction to energy to transportation. There's this very rapid increase in the 2000s, which I will take a credit for about 1% of that increase based on our report, When Will We Ever Learn? But really is a confluence of a lot of agencies, a lot of researchers, a lot of developments. But now we have something on the order of 100 to 300 coming out each year. And I think that this is a really, really important thing to recognize. We've got a lot more impact evaluation work coming out. Problem is, I'm hearing people saying, oh, maybe we've gone too far. And for that, I point out that we're spending about $40 to $50 million a year on impact evaluations and about $100 billion a year on overseas development and assistance, and that there's about more than $1 trillion a year being spent by low and middle income countries themselves on all the programs that could benefit from this kind of information. So we're still, this I think has to increase at least one order of magnitude before you'd begin to think that maybe we were addressing the full range of issues and questions. The other thing that comes up, see, I can't tell left from right, that's part of the problem, is that one of the things that came up when we looked at When Will We Ever Learn is that a lot of money was being put into studies, into evaluations, but not into impact evaluations. And there's been progress in this regard as well, but even here, this is some preliminary work where we looked at the 6 largest funders of global health programs, and we looked on their websites for published papers of process or impact evaluations. And this is what we found. Now, This is 2008 to 2013. So USAID passed its new evaluation policy. Somebody's going to correct me. 2011. So you haven't seen the impacts of that yet. And the other big thing that I want to point out here is that, sorry, the first point is that there's still in this group 235 process evaluations to 21 impact evaluations. A lot of that is USAID, but that also reflects what's happening in other bilateral agencies, which are mainly on process evaluations. And the last point I wanted to make was that this hides a huge fact, that almost all these impact evaluations, except for the USAID ones, are financed by the Gates Foundation and financed by DFID. So there's a huge concentration of funding. To their credit, they should be doing it. I'm glad they're doing it. I hope they will do more. But what it points out is that there's a free rider problem. All the rest of us, all the bilateral agencies, countries, everybody, is riding on the impact evaluations funded by those agencies, and other ones have to step up. And this is why one of the things we call for in the paper is that basically every agency doing development work should be putting 0.1% of its disbursements into the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, which is the appropriate international nonprofit agency that works kind of like the National Science Foundation. It provides grants to good quality research through a review process, and it has an advisory board, and it's known for quality and standards. And that's the appropriate avenue to put all this money in, because it achieves all kinds of things that I'll get to in a moment. So I'm still going backwards. Why foreign aid? Foreign aid can do more by financing impact evaluations than it can by financing direct services. Ultimately, countries have to finance their own services, their own development, and it tends to work better when they do it themselves. It's adaptable, and it's experimentation and adaptation in context that is how people learn, how societies grow, and how they develop. And the thing that foreign aid can bring to this kind of impact evaluation, if it's done appropriately through peer-reviewed processes and stuff like that, is it can bring independence and continuity. It solves the political economy problem of funding in scarce environments. It's very difficult to go to a country like Malawi and say, you should spend $2 million evaluating a new cash transfer idea. But a foreign aid agency can finance that impact evaluation, and the benefits of that impact evaluation go not only to Malawi, but to the other countries that might consider a similar kind of thing. It provides access to international networks of experts. Things that are done domestically don't get that kind of outside connection, and there is an international community that's improving the rigor, the quality, the kinds of things that were mentioned here about the roadmap and the measurement tool to know that there are other questionnaires out there, is a key part of making the knowledge process more efficient, more effective. And finally, I wrote here, led by or with strong engagement by domestic actors and researchers. This is also critical. It's part of what Marcus was saying in terms of having continued engagement. If there are local researchers involved, they're the ones who provide the follow-up. If it can't be led by them, their strong engagement assures that the research is more likely to be relevant, more likely to be taken up, and will leave lasting building of capacity. I'm a strong believer that capacity gets built from on-the-job training, not from outside training courses. And the best way to learn how to do an impact evaluation is work with some of the top people in the business. The second thing is foreign aid can do more by financing these things collectively. It's fine if USAID is going to finance an impact evaluation or the French foreign aid agency, but it actually works better if they put their money into a place like 3IE or a trust fund at the World Bank or the IDB, and it's done collectively. This is my point. It should be funded collectively. There are concentric values of information, concentric circles of information value that come out of these things. A single project impact evaluation shows you the policy impact or gives you lessons for what you could do for that project, but It also provides information for people doing similar kinds of projects in other areas. So that's the second level of the circle. The third level of the circle is you start doing systematic reviews when you have enough of these things and you can get ideas about what is really generalizable and what isn't. The fourth level of circle is you start actually building a knowledge base. You have information about behavior. You have information about theories and models that change the way we understand how things work. And the final circle is you've built the capacity and knowledge of people working on these things, and they're available for the next phase of research and the next phase of work. I won't go through, anyway, these are some of the benefits that we talked about in the paper. Finally, I want to say it can do more by financing topics like women's empowerment. This is a topic that isn't as heavily financed as something like health interventions or education or conditional cash transfers. So simply doing the research brings attention to it, which is important enough. But it also is really hugely important for revealing what are and are not real issues. I thought it was interesting, Marcus pointed out there were things they thought were constraints. They do the research and they'd found out it wasn't the constraint. So you can start focusing on the issues that really matter. And that's a huge thing. You have to always it's critical that we always be questioning our own assumptions, particularly in cases where cultural constructs get in the way. And I think this is one of the ways in which impact evaluation could make a huge difference as a central core function of foreign aid. So simply to conclude, foreign aid's future is about failed estates, humanitarian assistance, and public goods, knowledge being one of the primary ones. That knowledge requires good impact evaluations, and collective funding is the most effective way to do that. So I just conclude with, this is a call that funding agencies should put more money into collective institutions for impact evaluation with a specific attention to women's empowerment issues. Thanks.